Hello and greetings to one and all. Let me welcome you again to this channel as we continue to focus on topics and issues that are of relevance to our time. And so, rightly, we can refer to them as time of reckoning. I want you for a moment to imagine the most fortified structure that you can in your mind. Think of a building that has a very strong, well built foundation, almost unshakable, almost unmovable. The columns, the beams, cross beams are virtually indestructible. Can you think of a building like that? Many years ago, I heard about the CN Tower in Canada and the architectural detail and engineering that went into its foundation and into its building above the ground. And I was pretty impressed with how structurally fortified that building was. Of course, it might not be the most fortified building in the world, but it certainly is among those that are truly fortified. Some persons would talk about St. Peter's Basilica. Some persons would talk about Notre Dame in France. And there are so many very impressive buildings all over the world that structurally almost make them indestructible. I am using the building structure, the strong structural engineering of a building, to compare with the world that we find ourselves living in. The world that we live in, I don't know how you would describe the foundation, whether you would describe the foundation as its political, or its economic, or its religious part, or all of the above make up the foundation, the structural foundation of this world. What about the beams? What about the columns of this world? Well, whatever your descriptions of what make them up, I want to say to you, when those foundations were laid and the building blocks of the world that we now live in, this world order, the fact is that the black people of this world, the black nations of this world, were never there when it was being engineered. When the architects of this world were laying its foundation, building its pillars, we weren't there. In fact, for a large part of the laying of its foundation and the building of it, for a large part of that time, many of the world's population looking like me were either in slavery or under serious colonial siege. That's the truth. So we find ourselves in a world that others have built and structured, others have engineered without our input. Today, though, that world is aging. The world that I've just described is an aging world. Like the human body is growing old, and everything that grows old tend to be weakened. And sometimes they need overhauling or needs repairing. And so we find some kind of restructuring taking place in the world. And people will point to the fact that there are some people looking like me that are at the table. We can now point to universities in our hemisphere, if not in the countries where we live. And there are black leaders of those universities. We can point now to some scientists, doctors, professors, PhD holders, who look just like me. And they are sitting at the table where some decisions are now being taken. Like a building, when it is built for a while, it might need renovating. But the renovation will not affect the structure, will not affect the foundation, will not necessarily affect the physical structure as well. But you might want to repaint it. You might want to change some sheeting, you know. And so black political leaders, black scientists, black economists now find themselves at the table in this large structure where they are discussing what color to repaint the building and what type of new sheeting you might want to put as roof covers. And these blacks feel so comfortable having to participate in those minor issues of this large structure that they start to feel comfortable as though they help to design, they help to engineer the structure. And so we find ourselves playing in a global world situation that we are struggling to be made equal. We're real struggling. So when you look at institutions like the World Bank, the IMF, those financial institutions, when you look at institutions like the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, the World Health Organization, you will see a lot of black folks in some of those organizations, or what they call people of color. But the truth is, all they can do is participate in the periphery of these institutions, because the foundation of these institutions have been laid without their knowledge of it. Without their knowledge. They have no knowledge of it. And so we find that we don't ever be able to be equal partners in it. Not only that, the successors to those who have laid the foundation for this type of world feel more or less that people looking like me should be very comfortable for any levels of participation that we might have. We shouldn't complain. We shouldn't. So even though as a consequence of the way that they have structured the world situation, we now all find ourselves paying a hefty price. For example, we hear about climate change that threatens the life, health, and well-being of poorer nations, caused by those same nations that made the world the way it is, because of greed, for example, love for profit and wealth, and little care and consideration for the human well-being. But they don't want us to complain. They want us to just accept the world as it is, just to accept it. And we have political leaders that we have elected to government. And even though innately they know that the system is wicked, they find themselves having to play comfortable in it. They have to play comfortable in it. Right now, the global pandemic that is talked about, leading to this new thrust to vaccinate the world. The truth is, the governments of poorer nations are encouraging their citizens to be vaccinated with vaccines that they know nothing about. They don't know anything about it. All they know is what they are being told. And so, some of those nations that help lay the foundation, who help to engineer, who are among the architects of the building block of this present world order, many of their countries, like those in Europe, are saying this vaccine thing, we don't want it. Put a hold on it. And while they are putting a hold on it because of consequences that they deem life threatening to their citizens, we still find ourselves in poor nation having to still be pushing it with no regard for what are the obvious consequences that other people are finding. Why is that the case? Simply because we find ourselves in a do or die situation. The only way we can survive as a region, as a nation, as poor countries, third world countries, is if we have an open economy that is dependent, for example, on tourism and what you call outside investment. We depend on these to have a functioning economy and a functioning society. That's what our political directorates have learned because they have been trained to think by the people who lay the foundation for the building block of the world that we now have. They educate them so they think like them. You know, they are not thinking that as equal human beings, our responsibility should be to design and orchestrate a world that suits us. So when you take a quick look or quick rundown of how we get to where we're at, we were kidnapped, stolen from where we naturally belong on the continent of Africa. We were taken as enslaved people to all these different islands across the world. And while we are there, we reproduce, our ancestors did, and that's how we are here. And so there are many of us who show no regard for the suffering, the torture, the wickedness meted out to our ancestors. We now become sympathizers with the enslavers. So we allow them to change our name and give us theirs. We allow them to set up their religion and give it to us as our own. We allow them to give us a diet that's dangerous for us and forsaken ours. And everything that is culturally ours are labeled demonic, obia, wicked, no good, something to be laughed at. And we bought into it. We bought into that. So we are like servants around these houses. We are servants in the dwelling places of those persons who make those dwellings. So in other words, the world in which we live are like mansions belonging to the people who make them. And we are now like servants in these houses. And we like our status. We like it. To make a world for ourselves are too hard. We don't feel like we can get it do. We don't feel like we can do it. It's hard. So why not just settle for the crumbs that fall off the table of those who make this fortified world for themselves? That's how we are in this present world order. And it becomes so entrenched now that when we have leaders among us who speak against the world order, they're labeled troublemakers. It is quite interesting that an African leader, Dr. Magafuli, recently passed away. And I can't hear one leader in the Caribbean who have expressed sympathy and send condolences to that nation of Tanzania. Because President Magafuli has tampered with the golden calf of this world. He was a strong anti-gay person. He was a strong anti-same-sex person. Very strong. And any person or world leader who dare to stand against that kind of lifestyle is always going to be demonized and is not going to be recognized. So Amnesty International demonized him. There are some persons who felt that he was taken out, he did not die naturally. But the irony is, because we are content to be servants in this large global structure made for us, we depend on the science of these same builders of the world order. So if they decide to take out our leaders, we can't prove that they did nor disprove it. I remember nearly 20 years ago when the Prime Minister of Dominica, Rosie Douglas, died. There are those who are thinking on the left that his death was not natural. But every effort that we make to try to prove was futile. So his death was regarded as natural. President Hugo Chavez of Venezuela, the best that we could probably do is to try to use the science out of Cuba to see if his death was natural. But guess what? If the people who takes him out have science that we don't know about, how are we going to prove? So we do not have any intention, clearly have not demonstrated any intention as a people, as a race, to be able to develop the kind of science that is on par with those evil forces that can take out our leaders, and we do nothing about it. Do nothing about it. We can't develop the kind of science and protection for ourselves that we can create our own world. We can lay a foundation for a world of our own without having been taken out by those persons who do not like us. So we leave from the plantation as enslaved people, and we enter into a system of colonization where, while we were no longer enslaved in a physical sense, those persons who held us enslaved now complete their project of enslaving the mind. And so you could say that they have now completed that. And so here it is, from slavery to colonialism or colonization, to a situation where we become so comfortable. You would think that the natural progression would be from, emancipation to colonization to rebuilding what was lost. But we don't see it that way. Our leaders don't see it that way. They're very comfortable with slave names, slave diet, slave science, slave mentality, slave education, everything that was. We're still comfortable with it. And so that's where we find ourselves. Pathetic, isn't it? Pathetic. We still live in hope, though, that someday, we will find leaders among ourselves who are determined to do something about our condition. Because as long as we remain in our present state, we are just slaves in the master's house. We're just slaves in the master's house. In fact, there was a time when we could describe our situation as enslavement. That means we were forced into a situation over which we have no control. But now we are not enslaved anymore. We are now really slaves. So it was after colonialism that our slavery really began. Because you would feel after colonialism we have every opportunity to start doing for ourselves. But then we have surrendered. And so we really now are the kind of slaves that are truly impotent. We love being slaves, do we? Are we going to do something about our conditions? What are we telling our children? How do our children feel about the world we live in? Are they happy in it? It's the only world they know. It's the only world we know. But of course, history has taught us about a world that then was that we have lost. Paradise lost, paradise regained. Are we going to regain what we have lost? Or we just tell ourselves it is lost, never to be regained? Until we talk again, ponder these things. So long.